Okay, let's start examining the geopolitical issues of maritime areas. In this video, I will mostly focus on the stakes of these geopolitical issues, starting with the definition of geopolitics, which applies to the study of international relations, all the relations that international actors can have. So it's mostly about relations between the states, but it could also imply other actors such as NGOs or non-governmental actors like terrorist organizations or pirates, for example, in the seas. And in the seas and oceans, geopolitical relations are particularly complex due to the difficulty to enforce the international law in the ocean. It's an area of national power projection, which means that each nation tries to get some influence in the seas, but enforcing the law and even imposing its own will for a state is something difficult because of the hugeness of the seas and the fact that well, it's mostly a place of freedom. The management of the resources of the seas and of the sea traffic requires clearly international cooperation, but this management can also easily result in tensions and even in conflicts. And the trend that we have studied so far is that pressure on the seas traffic and resources is constantly increasing due to maritimization. Hence this question, who will control the seas? And I could have added, and who will protect the seas as well? So the first point will be about a presentation of the law and how it can be enforced on the seas. And by definition, state control is complex and limited. There is a framework of international law which has been signed by many states of the world in 1982 at a UN convention in Chile in a place called Montego Bay. So really this expression Montego Bay is a synonym of the international laws of the seas. And the first thing that you can observe on this map is that even though most states of the world have signed the Montego Bay Convention, some have not. And in these countries that have never signed the Montego Bay Convention, we find the United States. So the United States considers itself to be powerful enough not to comply to an international law at this level. It's in fact only one of the examples when the United States of America consider it does not have to respect the international laws as the other states. But anyway, so here are the very basics of the Montego Bay Convention. This is a very detailed presentation. I will try to simplify it a little. So basically I would like you to understand and remember that every state which has an access to the seas has two main types of national maritime areas. The closer to the coastline are the territorial seas, territorial waters, so a belt of water extending at 12 nautical miles, so it's approximately 22 kilometers. And on this area, the state rules completely sovereign. It can raise taxes on traffic, it can control trade and immigration, it has to protect the local environment. So it's like the rest of the country in a way. And then you have a zone called the exclusive economic zone. So it's a much wider zone over which the state has special rights and real sovereignty concerning all the resources that are in the sea and on the seabed or below the seabed, so notably the oil or gas resources, if they are, or minerals. But in the EEZ, the state cannot limit or control sea traffic on surface water. And the rest is the high seas, the international waters, where traffic is totally free, and the sea bottom is considered to be the heritage of all mankind, so it should be administered by the United Nations. On this map you can see all the zones in light blue, which are EEZs, and in dark blue the international waters. This is a graph that shows which states of the world have the largest EEZs, and addition to their land surface, you can see how wide are the USA and Russia, but obviously Russia has a rather small EEZ as opposed to, for example, France, which has the second largest EEZ in the world, a much wider zone than its land surface. This is largely due to the fact that France still possesses many overseas islands all over the world, and that has logically increased its exclusive economic zone. The general trend nowadays is that the notion of freedom of the seas is being challenged by a growing strategy of ocean grabbing by many states, but in fact mostly by a few powerful states. We will have several examples of that a bit later. And here on this map of Europe you can observe all the exclusive economic zones of the 27 states that are EU members. That's the reason why nothing is specified for Britain. And for example, you can see between France and Spain how the exclusive economic zone is being shared according to the UN Convention. So I talked about a trend of growing state control strategies all over the world on the seas, but I also need to examine the fact that maybe the most important rule in the seas is that there are very few rules actually. And that's a little chapter I've called When Deregulation Becomes the Rule. As stated in the title to Part A, state control is limited because it is complex and sometimes it is even impossible. An interesting statistic is about the percentage of containers in global trade which are actually controlled by any custom officer. And apparently it's only 1%. 1% of these big boxes are really controlled, which leaves a lot of room for an absence of clear regulation. So with this screenshot from the website of the famous British magazine The Economist, I want to illustrate an interesting aspect of deregulation in the seas. The title here is Why Do 1 in 10 Ships Fly Tiny Liberia's Flag? And it's true that the numbers of ships registered per countries can be very surprising. The answer is given by The Economist. It's a good way to avoid taxes and regulation. So here is what I'm talking about. In fact, on this graph, you can see the number of merchant ships which are registered by a state in the world. And you can see that the state that registers the largest number of merchant ships is Panama. So very little state in Central America. And in fact, if you look at the other important ones, you will find many very small states, like Liberia in Africa. These are called flags of convenience. In French, we call that pavillon de complaisance. In fact, when a shipping company has bought a ship, it can choose the nationality of the ship, and of course this nationality can change. And once you have chosen one nationality, you pay some taxes to a country, then the law of this country applies on the ship. So 3/4 of merchant ships in the world are registered under what we call a flag of convenience. That is to say, a sovereign state which is different from the state of the ship owner, but a state that offers many advantages in terms of taxation and regulation, and notably regulation on the laws of labor. So as a result, the sailors of the world are very often facing terribly difficult working and living conditions, and actually the crew of a merchant ship will often be very international, involving people from many of the poorest countries in the world, because these are jobs that people from better off countries simply don't want to take. And if shipping companies do register in flags of convenience, it is of course because it reduces their operation cost. So we can see that here as well, like many other examples in globalization, the search for low operation costs leads to a race to the bottom in terms of regulation of labor, in terms of regulation of pollution, for example. So the most important flags of convenience are Panama, Liberia, the Bahamas, the Marshall Islands. I mean, nobody really knows where the Marshall Islands is, but they have registered quite a few ships. Or the other Central American island of Antigua. In fact, you must understand that all these states are kinds of tax havens for the ships, and they have specialized in this activity. It's notably true of Liberia, or Panama, of course, even Malta in the European Union, even Greece to a certain extent. And of course, it's quite an unfair competition with the larger countries. For example, there are only 20 ships of the biggest shipping company of France, CMA CGM. Only 20 of their ships are registered in France, and they own 400 big ships. So that's quite an impressive number. Overall, nowadays in France, there are only 200 merchant ships that are registered under a French flag. They used to be 500 40 years ago. So clearly the competition of flags of convenience has been growing. Even a state like Luxembourg, which is landlocked, has no access to the seas, has more vessels under its registration than France. The result of that is that most of the profits of the shipping industry escape taxation, and most of the job which is done on the boats escapes any strong regulation. So now let's have a look at the different topics where we can observe that there would be a growing need for control on what is happening in the seas. I will try to be quite quick on these ones. First of all, of course, to protect the environment. Earlier in the lesson, we have talked a little bit about how limiting pollution in international waters can seem very difficult. The most visible example of pollution would be oil spills. So these are some pictures about one of the recent massive oil spills that has happened. It happened in the Indian Ocean during the summer of 2020, and with very negative impacts on the environment and consequently the tourism of the island of Mauritius. As said in the article, in quantity of oil, this disaster does not meet the terrible toll of other disasters in history, such as the Deepwater Horizon incident in the USA 10 years ago. But in fact, it's always very, very problematic. And even though events like this can be presented in the international press, what is impressive is that daily pollution by ships is almost invisible, and it is often due to their illegal search for reduction of operating costs always. Overall, some experts say that only 10% of the oil which is spilled in the seas is actually cleaned up. So it's a pollution which is very difficult to control. From a more general point of view, yes, for many companies the seas are used like a big garbage bin, because it's just impossible to control that. And I have already mentioned earlier in the lesson the continent of plastic which exists in the North Pacific between China and the USA, which is the most famous and visible part of that pollution. But unfortunately, this pollution is of course everywhere. So only NGOs can not only, but NGOs are mostly the actors who try to warn the world public opinion about these issues, just like some NGOs are also trying to warn public opinion about the issue of overfishing. So you probably know the famous worldwide environmental NGO called Greenpeace, which is involved on many different issues. A more specific NGO which has become very famous during the last decade due to its brutal forms of actions is Sea Shepherd, and they have started as an organization fighting against whale fishing, but it's been enlarging its activities in order to try and fight against illegal or simply industrial fishing industry all over the world. A second point that needs control, but here we can say that state control is more efficient, is tackling piracy. So in the case study about the Malacca Strait, the topic of piracy has already been covered. On this map you can see that indeed the Malacca Strait and more generally the seas of Southeast Asia, because of the big population and the complex archipelagos that we can find there, are clearly places of piracy. The Middle East, and in particular the Strait of Hormuz, is also a place of piracy, and for the rest it's mostly in the north of South America and in the Guinean Gulf in Africa. So in fact, often piracy is important in underdeveloped areas, not only because piracy can be a kind of illegal activity for poor people in countries where legal activities legal jobs are rather few. Valuable jobs in terms of revenues. It's also because in when you have poor countries, tackling piracy is almost impossible. Rich countries can tackle piracy in areas of great interest, but in the Guinean Gulf, for example, no big power is trying to do anything. So piracy is a very irregular problem, because when powerful states want to reduce it, they manage to reduce it quite significantly, actually. So there are some peaks. There was a peak at the beginning of the last decade, and it has reduced ever since. Maybe it will come back. Anyway, I would like you to remember that tackling piracy is often what is the most efficiently done, because it's an offensive against trade, piracy. So the interests of the big economies are affected by that. Controlling illegal flows is also something that needs to be controlled according to many states in the world. So it can be for various reasons. From a general point of view, the problem with illegal trade is that it raises no tax revenue, and that's the main problem. That's the reason why custom officers try to fight against that. Another danger of illegal trade is that it can be dangerous for the environment or the health of the people. This is notably the case of this famous example of cocaine traffic. That's an example of a south to north trade, because most of the plants that are needed for making cocaine are tropical plants, which are mostly cultivated in South America. So obviously cocaine is transported only in an illegal way. It can be done by plane. It is largely done by plane, notably to North America. But airports are more controlled than ports. And in fact, even if by definition it is impossible to measure the level of cocaine that is being traded overseas in the world, well, it exists, and as we said, with flags of convenience and all these sorts of things, it's very difficult to control that. A flow which is illegal but more successfully controlled by the states, and when I say successfully, of course, it's kind of ironic, because for humanitarian reasons, the way these flows are limited is often very problematic. So I'm talking about flows of undocumented migrants, so illegal migrants. On this map, you can see how much the Mediterranean is an important passage in the migration of undocumented people coming from Central Africa. Mostly via Libya. We already mentioned that. Libya being what we call a failed state. It means that government control is very difficult, because Libya is more or less in a situation of civil war. And as a result, many migrants are trapped in a kind of human traffic and pay smugglers, sending them on the seas. The coast guards of Morocco, of Libya, of Turkey are paid not only by their country but also by European countries, because they are paid not to let them pass. Of course, there's a lot of corruption in this area, but the result of this, the demographic pressure in Africa, the huge development inequalities between Africa and Europe, results in a constant pressure for migration. And the result, notably during the last decade, in particular since 2015, is that the Mediterranean Sea is increasingly a cemetery. Migrant deaths in the seas of the Mediterranean the numbers are very impressive. It can be counted by thousands. And of course, this number is only a minimum, because many bodies are never found, and many many ships are not registered, so when they sink, nobody knows really. There are, I have mentioned the factors of this migration, the contrast in development, the population growth in sub-Saharan Africa, and also the growing political instability that exists in sub-Saharan Africa, notably just south of the Sahara, a zone that we call the Sahel. This is where you have Mali, for example, of Burkina Faso, where you have very dangerous Islamist terrorism. The war in Syria, it's not in Africa, it's in West Asia, but the war in Syria was also a big provider of people looking for asylum, and with this surge in the number of migrants trying to reach the European coast, well, the management of this issue by the European Union was clearly condemned at the international level by the United Nations and by many NGOs for being disrespectful of basic human rights. Clearly, the policy of the European states these days is one of strict control of immigration, and so total rejection of illegal immigration, and this is very costly at the humanitarian level, precisely because many ports in Europe will not accept ships of NGOs that would rescue migrants, notably the ships by an NGO called SOS Méditerranée have often been rejected by the authorities of Italy, notably a few years ago, an attitude highly criticized by the United Nations and the international press overall.